Previously, on part 1 of my Cochise County special. Starting in the small town of Dragoon, 60 miles southeast of Tucson, I followed a spur trail along the north side of the Dragoon Mountains. I visited the historic Dragoon Springs stage station, used as part of the Butterfield Overland Mail Service, which was also home to several deaths during both the Civil and Apache War. From there, I used a mix of paved and dirt roads to head for camp at Cochise Stronghold. The stronghold was a natural fortress used by Cochise and his followers as they battled encroaching U.S. cavalry troops stationed across the Sulphur Springs Valley. I enjoyed a great night camped out in the shadow of the granite cliffs before getting back on the road for Pierce the next morning. Today, I continue with day 2 of my trip, heading east into the Chiricahua Mountains to check out the ruins of Fort Rucker and the final resting place of infamous outlaw Johnny Ringo. With lots of structures to explore, some big views, as well as lots of miles to cover, it'll be a busy day before making it to my next camp back in the Dragoons at the abandoned Middlemarch Mine. After leaving my camp at Cochise Stronghold in the northeast part of the Dragoon Mountains, I set my sights east for the small town of Pierce. The road out of the stronghold was a mix of rural paved roads and dirt connectors. This area is moderately populated with houses spread out throughout the surrounding area. Within about 10 miles, I arrived at the outskirts of the small town of Pierce. While nearly a ghost town at several times, the surrounding area, which includes the community of Sunsites, is home to a little under 2,000 residents today. I pulled off at the Pioneer Cemetery just outside of town and decided to walk around. According to some of the signs, several notable people are buried here, including Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard, General Sherman's assistant, and a fair share of veterans dating all the way back to the Civil War. Officially opened in 1916 thanks to a deed from President Woodrow Wilson, the area has been used as a burial ground since the 1880s. The cemetery is split into many sections, although the oldest, most historic section is perhaps the most interesting. Many miners and early settlers from the area are buried in this section. Numerous graves also contain those who contracted influenza following the deadly 1918 outbreak. While I can only find one Civil War veteran, a member of the Minnesota Infantry, others do remain, as well as plenty of World War I and II veterans. The cemetery is clearly well cared for, and the roughly 800 graves made for an interesting walk. The actual town of Pierce was founded by James Pierce, a miner and cattleman, when he discovered gold in the area in 1894. A post office was established 2 years later after Pierce's gold discovery led to the creation of the Commonwealth Mine. The town boomed, opening a railroad station and having 1,500 residents by 1919. The Commonwealth, which sits on a hill just south of town, produced over 1 million tons of silver and some gold ore, worth a collective $10 million. One of the part owners of the mine was a geologist named Daniel Barringer, who had previously made important scientific discoveries at one meteor crater up in the northern part of the state. As the mine was played out in the 1930s, the population declined and became nearly a ghost town when the mine permanently closed in the 40s. Today, the past mine workings are clearly visible on the hill past town, but remain on private property. The downtown Main Street area is home to the old post office, the historic general store, and a few more rustic buildings. While there are some things to see, people do still live here and many of the areas are privately owned. Past Pierce, I continued onto Highway 191. Some additional mining remnants were visible from the road. Rolling hills and grasslands dominated this central part of the wide Sulphur Springs Valley. The road swung south into the town of Sunizona, and I pulled off at the only gas station in the area to top off the tank. I also topped off the cooler with a few essentials. I turned off the main highway and continued east on State Route 181 from here. The road remained fairly uneventful, dominated by agriculture and occasional houses, but was aiming me straight for the Chiricahua Mountains, now dead ahead. As the paved highway swung back north, I stayed straight onto Turkey Creek Road, which quickly turned back to dirt. The road remained wide and fast-moving as I passed more orchards, a scenic bridge, and got into the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. The southern Chiricahuas is an area I've never been to before, and a few random historic sites meant it was worth a side trip. Of course, further to the north is Fort Bowie, Apache Pass, and the scenic Rustler Park area, which by itself make for a worthwhile trip. The terrain got progressively more interesting the further east I headed. The name Chiricahua is thought to derive from the Aztec words Chiwi-Kawi, which I'm sure I just nailed the pronunciation of, meaning Turkey Mountain. Apparently, the area was once home to an abundance of wild turkeys, and being that I was on Turkey Creek Road, that seems to check out. A few miles off the pavement, the view really opened up. Rocky outcrops up on the hills and the highest reaches of the 9,700-foot summit of Chiricahua Peak loomed in the distance. I found myself in a wide valley with no other traffic and a set of power lines. This was really the first moment in the trip where I felt truly away from it all. Only a couple miles further down, I pulled off the road at my next stop. Here, in the middle of nowhere, is a historic gravesite. And while it technically sits on private land right next to a house, has a designated trail and official signage. This was the gravesite of infamous outlaw Johnny Ringo. I walked along the fenced trail and soon arrived at a shady area overlooking Turkey Creek. The site has a historical marker, gravesite, and donation box. Born in May 1850, John Peters Ringo, better known as Johnny, had a long and checkered past. Ringo fought in the Mason County War before moving to Cochise County in 1879. He joined the Cochise County Cowboys, a loose connection of outlaws and gunmen. He was known to associate with Sheriff Johnny Behan, Ike Clanton, and Frank Stillwell. Ringo was known to have a bad temper, once shooting a man who refused a complimentary shot of whiskey. He had a confrontation with Doc Holliday in January 1882 and was thought to have been involved in ambushing Virgil Earp and killing Morgan Earp following the events of the OK Corral shootout. This certainly put him in the wrong crowd, becoming an enemy of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. Ringo was in a posse that pursued Earp during his vendetta ride. On July 13, 1882, Ringo was found dead here, lying against a tree in Turkey Creek Valley. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the head, and he was buried on site. While officially ruled a suicide by the coroner, those who witnessed the body had other beliefs. Of course, back in the Wild West, spotty witness accounts and stories from the incident circulated a wide range of theories. Some believe he was killed by Wyatt Earp himself, others say Doc Holliday tracked him down following their confrontation, and a few other names also come up too. But of course, nothing is conclusive. Other than visiting the grave and getting lost in the lore a little bit, there really isn't much else to see here. I returned back to the Jeep and got back on the trail. While not completely out of the way, this would set me up for my next stop about 25 miles away at Fort Rucker. I retraced the route back out of Turkey Creek Canyon. After traversing the 4.5 miles back out nearly to Highway 181, I stayed left to follow Kai-Kendall Cutoff, which would connect me directly with the trail to my next stop. The drive wasn't much to write home about, as the road remained a wide, graded road with a very minor water crossing at one point. The mostly smooth road allowed me to make some quick miles, which would help out later in the day. After 7 additional miles, I arrived at Rucker Canyon Road, and I stayed left to head east back towards the Chiricahuas. The road remained wide and fast-moving at first. Some sections contained heavier washboards than others, but as the road gently climbed, things got smoother. Rolling hills came into view, and the shrubbery began to get a bit thicker. I was now on the northern edge of the Swiss Helm Mountains, a range I had never even heard of before. While a small area, they contain the Leslie Canyon National Wildlife Refuge just a bit further south, and about 25 miles to the south was the Mexican border. Past another junction, Rucker Canyon Road gets more scenic. I crossed a rustic-looking wooden bridge and continued my climb. Over the 13 miles on this road, I'd gain about 1,000 feet in elevation. The road remained in great shape, and the trees got taller with a hint of fall vegetation in some places. There were a few residential areas as I entered into Whitewater Draw, where the canyon slowly began to close in. The road here was fun to drive, with occasional glimpses of the rocky outcrops of the upper Chiricahuas. I passed another junction and stayed right as the road got narrower and followed the scenic Cottonwood Creek in places. Now back in the forest, the air was cooler. Not far from the last trail split, I pulled into a small parking area. At this clearing, I'd have to park the Jeep and walk the rest of the way into the historic Fort Rucker. Once again, I was the only one here. I grabbed a snack and my camera and set off down the trail. It was a nice, easy walk as I crossed a rocky creek and immediately came upon a large wooden building and corral. From here, I could see other buildings spread out across the area, and it was almost a bit overwhelming. Most abandoned places don't have quite so much to check out. I opted to continue past the wooden barn to the furthest ruin and hit all of the buildings in a clockwise walkthrough. Camp Rucker, originally called Camp Supply, was established here in 1878. One of many forts throughout the Chiricahuas and Sulphur Springs Valley, the camp was originally intended to protect settlers in the area with a mounted cavalry unit based on site. 2 companies of what were called the Indian Scouts were based at Camp Supply. Company D, led by 1st Lieutenant Austin Henley, and Company C, led by 2nd Lieutenant John A. Rucker. The Scouts consisted of groups of about 40 Native Americans and enlisted men who joined for 6 months at a time. Their goal was to guard and escort assignments along major travel routes through the area. They also worked to track down Chiricahua Apache who had not yet settled on reservations. On July 11, 1878, both Henley and Rucker, along with their scouts, were camped along the river below camp. As they began back to base, they were caught in a rainstorm. Noticing that the water was rising and their supplies across the river were at risk of being swept away, both officers set out to save the supplies. Lieutenant Henley's horse stumbled and Henley was swept away by the flash flood. In a desperate and heroic attempt to save his comrade, Lieutenant Rucker entered the raging water, but was ultimately swept away and drowned as well. Rucker's body was recovered 3 hours later, a mile and a half downstream. Both Rucker and Henley had attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, although only Henley had actually graduated. On October 1st, 1878, the name of Camp Supply was changed to Camp J.A. Rucker to honor his valiant efforts. Both commanders were buried at Fort Bowie, but moved several times in the years since. Rucker was later reinterred in Arlington National Cemetery. Despite early tragedy, the camp continued to function. Initial structures on site consisted of buildings with log sides and canvas tent roofs. While simple and relatively isolated, Camp Rucker boasted an impromptu bakery, a commissary, guardhouse, and living quarters. According to some, Geronimo surrendered to U.S. forces here at Camp Rucker in late 1879, but quickly escaped. By May of 1880, a permanent building program began, aiming to replace the initial impromptu structures with more stable and comfortable accommodations. A new commissary was built, and a building thought to be officers' quarters were constructed by July. However, due to increasing peace and the quelling of the Apache War, Camp Rucker was abandoned sometime in late 1880. Within years of being abandoned, Camp Rucker became a ranching headquarters. First claimed under squatters' rights in 1883 by Michael Gray, a Tombstone Justice of the Peace, the old Camp Rucker was later purchased by the Hamps, a German artist and his wife, in 1896. The property changed hands again in 1919 when it was bought by Charles and Mary Rack, who operated a cattle ranch on the property. During this time, some of the buildings were repurposed and some of the adobe bricks from the old military buildings were moved to a wood-framed house to provide better insulation during the winter months. The property was transferred to the U.S. Forest Service in 1970, who has since made preservation efforts to the site and added informational signs. Today, several remnants from both its time as a military outpost and as a ranching headquarters remain. The newer ranch buildings remain in better shape. A fairly large house remains on the southeast corner of the property. This was the living quarters for the Rack family. It contains multiple levels, a variety of rooms, all in surprisingly good shape. A large blue room with numerous windows, a fireplace, tiles, and shelves remain on one end of the house.
This room definitely seems nicer than the other ones in this building. It's actually a huge building. The different levels and the rooms just seem to keep on going, but I reached the edge here. And this is kind of the biggest room of the house. Also in the best shape. Pretty awesome.
With a kitchen, root cellar, and lounge area, this impressive structure remains well preserved. A large wooden barn and corral remain closer to the center. This building likely dates to the early 1900s when the property became a ranch, although it could be from earlier. Several different pens and wooden fencing remain. The officers' quarters, built sometime near the end of Camp Rucker's military life, contains a large common area. Adobe bricks line the outside. To the north end is where most of the old military structures remain. A monument to John Rucker, a water structure, the original bakery building, and the ruins of the commissary building all remain in place from the late 1800s. Although the bakery building has had some modifications, including the addition of windows, the original outline of the old stove remains inside on the wall today. A few other markers remain scattered around the property, and a thorough walk around is definitely worth the time. The extensive ruins and unique history offer a lot to the inquisitive visitor. After spending an hour and a half walking around the ruins of Camp Rucker, I eventually made my way back to the parking area. From here, I opted to briefly retrace my way back out on the road to the Rucker Group Campground. Just off the main road, this large area features group camping sites, picnic tables, and a restroom. I decided to break here for a late lunch. In keeping with the theme of the afternoon, it was an MRE, arguably one of the worst menus, and of course, a Mountain Dew SA. It was nice to enjoy a few quiet minutes at the campground, but it was only about 3 o'clock. While I had considered camping in the area, the fact that I had an 11 a.m. tour at Courtland tomorrow, across the valley, made me want to push for a closer campsite back in the Dragoons. With a quick lunch eaten, I grabbed some more of my MRE and returned to the Jeep. From here, I'd be up against the clock, with about 2 hours of daylight to cover the 50 miles to my new planned camping area near Middlemarch Pass. The drive out of the Chiricahuas was mostly uneventful as I slowly dropped elevation. I played everyone's favorite game of seeing how long you can follow someone without them noticing, but eventually got past. The terrain flattened back out past the Swiss Helm Mountains as I entered back into the Sulphur Springs Valley once again. Here, occasional hills broke up the otherwise monotonous rolling grasslands. The road got progressively in better shape, and I was able to make good time heading west. While not the most entertaining drive, sometimes you don't have a choice. This part of the state has a lot of paved roads and private land, meaning sometimes you don't have many options. About 25 miles from Camp Rucker, I began to approach the small town of Elfrida. The area is dominated by agriculture and crop circles. I quickly reached Highway 191 and continued across. On the other side, the road remained pavement briefly before returning to dirt. This area receives a fair amount of traffic, so the road is kept in good shape. I slowly gained elevation as I climbed back out of the valley and headed for a set of hills just ahead. At the base of the hill, known as Brown's Peak, I continued straight at a junction for Gleeson. The road here was called Ghost Town Trail, which was awesome, and I would be back on this loop for many of my stops tomorrow. The road continued to climb towards Courtland. Here, numerous ruins lined both sides of the road. Old building walls, foundations, mine tailings, and all kinds of other interesting things remained. As tempted as I was to stop, this was just a sneak peek for my adventures tomorrow. Plus, I really needed to continue towards camp. Not far down the road, I passed the official entrance to Courtland Ghost Town, which was gated, but signs confirmed my tour for tomorrow. Now past Courtland, it was just a few more miles before getting back to Pierce, where I had started the day. And aside from occasionally having to stop and temporarily retighten one of my lights that was falling off, the drive was exceptionally smooth. This section of road was incredibly fast and easy going, which was great as I was now racing the sunset. Up to this point, my tires were still aired up and I was pleasantly surprised with the ride quality. By about 4:45, I had made it to Pierce. I cruised through the downtown area and stayed left, back onto the same road I took this morning. A few miles further west of Pierce, I split off onto Middlemarch Road and entered back into the Dragoons. This is a road I've been on several times before. It traverses the Dragoon Range and connects with Tombstone after about 20 miles. By this point, the sun had already dipped behind the mountains. Middlemarch Road had some washboards and passed a few residential areas as it snaked deeper into the mountains. I entered back into Coronado National Forest and began to climb towards Middlemarch Pass. After around 4.5 miles, I arrived at a wash and split off the main road. Marked not maintained for public use, I was now just a little over a mile from my stop for the night. I engaged full overlander mode and proceeded up the wash. The trail here was narrower and filled with some fine sand. I remained in the wash for quite some time as I traversed deeper into Middlemarch Canyon towards Middlemarch Mine. While not overly technical, this trail was certainly a nice change of pace from the rest of my travels today. The road turned to hard-packed dirt and exited the wash as the surrounding terrain slowly slipped into darkness. Behind me, dusk enveloped the Sulphur Springs Valley. Despite the lack of light, the drive was incredibly scenic. A few off-camber sections and minor washouts slowed my pace in places as I continued further from the main road. Shortly after 5, foundations came into view and things opened up as I came to a clearing. To my left was the ruins of the Middlemarch Mine, which marked my camp for the night. With the light now fading fast, I quickly backed the Jeep into a small clearing amidst the rock walls of the abandoned mining operation. The first order of business was getting camp set up. I was able to get the tent unwrapped, unfolded, and set up quickly. Unlike last night, I would need to get the camp kitchen box out tonight to cook dinner. My table, a chair, and lights also came out too. Luckily, there was plenty of room here to spread things out, and having the rock walls and foundations behind camp made for a unique spot. Some high clouds and a nearly full moon made for a great sunset view over the slag pile. All right, we've made it to night number 2's camp. Just minutes to spare. The sun had already gone behind the mountain there, but literally pulled into camp here about 2 or 3 minutes before sunset time. So definitely pushed it close, but today was a busy day. Long mileage. Initially when I was planning this, I was thinking about staying near Fort Rucker, but decided to head up here and try and camp right here at the Middlemarch Mine. Now, if this looks familiar, we've actually been here before. Me and my cousin spent about 5 minutes here on our Southeastern Arizona special back in 2017. Didn't know anything about the mine. I just called it an unknown mine, but have since done some research and wanted to come back and explore a little bit more. So it's getting pretty dark already. I need to get focused on dinner now that I've got camp set up. But tomorrow morning, we'll probably walk around some of these structures. This was obviously some kind of mill or processing place. There's all kinds of tailings down in the creek below. But tomorrow we'll check that out in the morning and then be making our way back out to Courtland. I know we passed through there earlier, got a little taste of some of the stuff we get to see tomorrow. We'll be checking that out and also checking out Gleeson before camping on the other side of the Dragoons at my 3rd and final campsite. Not the last night of the trip, but there's no one back here and it should be a great night, nice and calm. And not every day you get to camp near some old mining ruins. So I got all the needed gear out and set up the old Coleman stove. I fired it up, grabbing a nice cold 4 Peaks to enjoy while cooking. Tonight for dinner I'd be making chicken quesadillas, which I had originally planned for last night. With some less than ideal folding skills tonight, I decided to throw another tortilla on top to keep things in place. Paired with another Dragoon beer and some hot sauce, I sat down to enjoy. Tucked away down Middlemarch Canyon, this would be my highest elevation camp of the trip at around 5,400 feet. The chilly evening air quickly set in. I did a preliminary walk around the lower levels of the ruins, but decided to save the scrambling up the rocky hill and full investigation for tomorrow. Back at camp, there wasn't a whole lot to do. I poured a glass of whiskey and headed up into the tent to relax and do some reading. It was actually nice to have a bit of downtime to unwind. Today had been a busy and eventful day, covering a lot of stops and mileage from where I started at Cochise Stronghold. Night was calm and mild, with a few long, wispy clouds hanging overhead. By about 10:30, I had worked my way into the sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep shortly after. Tune in next time as I continue on another action-packed day of my Cochise County trip. I'll explore the foundations, mines, and history of the Middlemarch Mine I camped out at, before returning back to the Courtland area for an extensive history tour of a rich copper mining boomtown. I'll go on a guided tour of some of the important buildings and modern-day renovations before splitting off on my own to do some more exploring. Later in the afternoon, I'll visit the nearby ghost town of Gleeson before making my way through Tombstone. I'll end the night camped in the absolutely stunning western part of the Dragoons at, arguably, my best campsite yet.